I keep seeing videos about how our timelines are all messed up, like how I didn't know that woolly mammoths were around at the same time that the pyramids were being built, but there's actually so many other weird overlaps that are blowing my mind. And before we dive in, if you love the spooky and dark, you'll love the podcast. Like how Dali died the same year that Daniel Radcliffe was born. And even weirder, Eminem and Picasso were alive at the same time for 2 years. Rosa Parks lived long enough to be able to see the first 2 Shrek movies in theaters. And let's not forget that in her lifetime, she actually sued the band Outkast. When the Declaration of Independence was being signed, no one knew that dinosaurs even existed. Like, dinosaurs had actually not been discovered yet. And let's not forget that Cleopatra was born closer to the invention of the iPhone than to the actual pyramids being built. This one sounds fake, but is totally real. The last person to collect a pension from the Civil War died the year that Obama took office. And finally, the oldest tree alive today was around at the time of woolly mammoths. And not only that, but when the last woolly mammoth died, this tree was already 1,000 years old.
Blood-curdling facts that you wish you never knew. When creating the Pirates of the Caribbean ride at Disneyland, they couldn't create skeletons that looked realistic enough, so they used real human skeletons. Since then, they've removed all but one. Ducks sometimes become cannibals due to boredom, meaning they kill and eat each other. This behavior begins as early as 4 weeks old. In its natural habitat, a blowfish isn't actually ugly. This is one 3,000 feet below sea level. But this is one after extreme tissue damage after being pulled up rapidly by a fisherman. Men who are hanged get what is called a death erection, which I'm assuming is pretty awkward for the family. The first firefighter killed in 9/11 attacks was struck dead by a falling body in the courtyard. One of them was killed on his way in, and the other was killed on his way out. Right now, there are tiny little bugs on your face munching on your dead skin. Your bones are wet. If you don't have kids, you will break an unbroken line of children that has gone on for tens of millions of years. A scientist studying death asked a man who was about to be executed by a guillotine if he would blink after his head was chopped off. He ended up blinking for 30 seconds.
See a picture that just gives you like full body chills. This photo was captured in 2007 and it seems like kind of a harmless picture, right? There's nothing that's very out of the ordinary. It's taken outside of an apartment window by a woman named Maria Leontinka in Czech Republic. A man was just outside of the apartment. He was screaming, he was shouting, and this woman took the picture because she was going to report it to the property manager, having no idea that something very dark just occurred in that building. Inside that apartment building in 209 was a family of 4. All of which had been decapitated, and it's believed that man who was captured was responsible. Police are then able to connect the dots of another picture that was taken across town on the same exact day. It's believed to have been the same man, that he approached this group of teenagers and he was bragging about what he had just done, and they weren't sure if he was for real, if he was kidding, psychotic, so they took a picture of his face before he eventually ran. And this was the best shot they got. They even sketched the man, but they never found him, and his motive remained unknown.
Do you think this boy's tragic death was a murder? And was it part of a larger cover-up? This is the tragic story of Grant Solomon. In July of 2020, Grant Solomon passed away after his truck rolled over him. But surprisingly, Grant's body didn't have any scratches on it. According to Grant's father, who is the only witness, Grant's truck rolled backwards and dragged him down into a ditch. But when at the hospital, Grant's father refused to have an autopsy done and then later on refused to have the truck looked at to see if it was malfunctioning. It seemed like he was trying to wrap up the investigation as quickly as possible. This started setting off red flags for people, especially Grant's mother, because all of this happened before she even got to the hospital. And then, less than a year later, Grant's sister Gracie releases a bombshell YouTube video claiming that her father had been abusing her entire life. She believes that her father killed Grant because he was planning on coming forward with allegations against his father. And there's a lot of evidence to back her up. Grant's truck was not malfunctioning, and the medical examiner ruled that Grant's injuries were not consistent with being dragged by a truck. Instead, the major injury that he had was blunt force trauma to the head. Grant's father still walks as a free man. But right now, there's a petition that you can sign to help the family open an independent investigation into his death. It seems like everyone's talking about this case right now, so hopefully we can enact some real change.
Imagine getting married only to be decapitated by your husband 3 months later. 21-year-old couple Jared and Angie got married in October 2022. Around 4 p.m. on the 11th of January, police were called to their home in Texas. Police made a grim discovery in the pair's bathroom after finding, quote, what appeared to be the head of the victim to be in the shower, end quote. Angie's body was discovered on the floor near the bed in a pool of blood with multiple stab wounds to her back. It was actually Jared's poor parents that initially made this discovery after entering the home. They then obviously alerted police to what they found. Jared was arrested and has confessed to killing his wife with a kitchen knife. Jared was actually captured on CCTV, casually stealing a bottle of beer from Angie's workplace just minutes after it's believed that he killed her. Angie's friends have reported to police that the couple's relationship was toxic and Jared was very controlling. Jared's bond is currently set at $500,000.
My wife killed me, and our parrot exposed her. My name is Marty Durham, and here's my rather unusual story. The events take place in 2015 when I was found shot dead at my home at the age of 46 in Michigan, United States. I was struck by 5 bullets. Next to me was my wife, Glenette Durham, who had also been shot in the head. Initially, investigators leaned towards a double homicide attempt, but they quickly became suspicious of my wife, who had allegedly killed me and then attempted suicide. However, she vehemently denied all accusations. At this stage of the investigation, a key witness, Bud, our parrot, comes into play. Following the tragedy, family members took custody of the bird, and it began repetitively mimicking a conversation using both deep and high-pitched voices resembling mine and Glenette's. It tirelessly repeated the words, "Don't shoot." The police interpreted these voices as those of our couple, leading them to consider it a domestic tragedy. A parrot expert psychologist later confirmed with certainty that Bud was imitating an argument between a man and a woman. Prior to the incident, Glenette and I were facing financial problems related to gambling, and my wife had already left several suicide notes. Glenette's trial took place in 2017, and she was found guilty of first-degree murder. She was ultimately sentenced to life imprisonment.
Blood-curdling facts that you wish you never knew. Crocodiles are capable of galloping, similar to a horse. Luckily, alligators cannot. And while we're at it, tarantulas can swim. It's extremely common after you die that there will be extreme gas buildup and you will burp after death. And sometimes dead bodies can even sit up on their own. Also, if a pregnant woman dies, the gas buildup in her body can actually forcefully push a baby out. In other words, a post-mortem baby bazooka. Hearing is the last bodily function to go after one dies, so it's very possible that the last thing you ever hear is the paramedic calling off your CPR. Blue-eyed people are statistically more likely to suffer from depression and alcoholism. Sometimes an Amber Alert causes the kidnapper to panic and kill the child immediately. Every year you live through the future anniversary of your death. CNN has a pre-recorded broadcast for the end of the world. Most laugh tracks for TV shows were recorded in the early 1950s, meaning that you hear dead people laugh. If you're attacked by a bear, it won't try to kill you like other predators. Instead, it'll just start eating you. One day someone will mention you for the last time, then they'll never ever mention you again.
This priest was given the death penalty, and he's the only priest in American history to be executed by the government. This is Father Hans Schmidt. He was born in the German Empire in 1881, and he eventually immigrated over to America. From his childhood, Hans had a terrible life. He would often watch his father mercilessly beat his mother on his farm. At one point, he beheaded 2 geese and kept their severed heads in his pocket. This is when he was a kid. He frequented the village slaughterhouse and just liked to watch them slaughter innocent animals. And he was even known to experiment and dissect animals himself and consume their blood. This is all while he was a kid. Eventually, though, Hans Schmidt was ordained as a priest, even though a lot of other priests said that he was mentally unfit for the role. But even from the very beginning of his time as a priest, Hans didn't act like a priest. He often visited prostitutes, he molested altar boys, he had affairs with several women, and he gave very eccentric sermons that kind of pissed parishioners off. Eventually, though, he immigrated to New York City in America, and in 1912 he met a woman named Anna Almuller, the housekeeper at the rectory of St. Boniface Church. Apparently, Hans heard a voice from God telling him that he needed to love Anna, so he started to see her secretly. Obviously, as you know, this was forbidden as a priest, but he still did it anyways. And also in that same year, Hans started to have a relationship with a New York City dentist named Ernest. And this is interesting. Eventually, Hans would even claim that he enjoyed Ernest's company more than Anna's. Eventually, Hans secretly married himself and Anna. He performed the marriage ceremony himself. Obviously, once again, this was forbidden. And these two used to get freaky inside of the church. They would actually do it on the altar inside of the church. And one night while they were doing it on the altar inside of St. Joseph's Church in New York City, Hans apparently received a message from God telling him that he needed to sacrifice Anna. Apparently, he heard this command from God so many times that he had to tell Anna, and she told him that he's crazy. But then on the night of September 2nd, 1913, Father Hans Schmidt decided he needed to make the sacrifice. So on that night, he headed over to the apartment that he shared with Anna. He slashed her throat, proceeded to drink her blood, and sexually assaulted her as she bled out on the bed, dying. After Anna was dead, Hans, the priest, then dismembered her body and threw her body parts in the Hudson River. The next day, he then returned to the church, performed the mass, and acted like nothing ever happened. One of Anna's body parts eventually washed ashore though, and it was wrapped in a pillowcase. And through the price tag on the pillowcase, they were able to track it to a store in Newark, New Jersey, which then led police to the apartment of Hans and Anna, where they eventually found dried blood and arrested Hans. The trial was very interesting and a lot of bombshells were dropped. Hans tried to claim insanity, but the prosecution eventually brought in a German immigrant named Bertha. And apparently Hans had paid Bertha to dress up and look like Anna, go in and purchase a life insurance policy in her name with Hans listed as a beneficiary. He was eventually found guilty and sentenced to death, and on February 18th, 1916, he was sent to the electric chair. And after he was pronounced dead, Hans Schmidt became the only priest to ever be executed by the United States government and given the death penalty.
Do not watch this video if you are easily disturbed. This is this sickening, very recent case of Lily Peters. On the 24th of April 2022, 10-year-old Lily Peters was making her way home from her auntie's house in Wisconsin. She was biking and she was familiar with this route because she'd done it many times before. When she didn't return home that night, her dad reported her missing to police. What transpired was her parents' worst nightmare. Her body was discovered the following day at around 9 a.m. Officers located a bike that ended up being Lily's in the woods near a walking trail at the end of her aunt's street, and her body was discovered shortly after. Disturbing details emerged about Lily's death. She'd suffered blunt force trauma and had been strangled. Her body had then been SA'd. But who on earth would do such a thing to such an innocent little girl? 2 days after she disappeared, police charged Lily's 14-year-old cousin, Carson Peters. He'd allegedly been riding home with Lily when the horrific incident occurred. It's alleged that he punched her in the stomach and attacked her. Now, the case is still ongoing, but he has admitted to the attack. Interestingly, his father is Adam Berger, who is pictured here. He spent 3 years in prison for being a convicted pedophile. Now, Carson's bail is set to $1 million, and if convicted, he could spend life in prison.
Forcing me to drink ammonia was my mom's favorite hobby. My name is Dave Poser, the author of A Child Called It. I was born on December 29, 1960 in San Francisco. Since I was a child, I was treated differently from my siblings. While they were pampered, I was subjected to cruel treatment. I barely received food and water at home, and the longest I went without food was for 10 consecutive days. To survive, I sneaked into the cafeteria during recess and ate frozen fruit trays. After several days without seeing me begging for food, my mother became suspicious. In order to see what I was eating, she shoved her hand up my throat, causing me to vomit. And then she forced me to eat everything I had just thrown out. You may wonder why my father did not protect me. My mother did everything when no one was around, and my father was the only one who could protect me until they got separated and I ended up with my mother. The beginning of my horrific nightmare was when my mother said, "You're all mine now. Too bad your father is not here to protect you." I became the family slave from that day. I often took care of my newborn brother. Instead of throwing a diaper filled with feces into the trash, my mom used it to wipe my face and even stuck it on me. Without food and water, drinking ammonia was another option. Those were my daily things, but what about punishment? My mom burned my arm on a hot stove, threw a knife at my chest, or forced me to sit in a freezing cold bath for 2 hours. After 5 years, I finally confessed to a nurse at my school who saw my bruises. I was then set free and sent to a foster family at the age of 12, and my life took a new turn. After all I had been through, I consider myself fortunate to have escaped the nightmare of family violence. I wrote 14 books about my life as a victim of child abuse for kids, teens, and adults. I also wrote self-help books to assist others in overcoming the challenges and abuse they have faced. Although you may no longer be a victim of abuse, the fear and trauma will continue to haunt you until you have the courage to on instead of running away. My courage came in the form of forgiveness. I forgave my father for ignoring the abuse, and I wrote to my mother expressing my love for her, but stating that I would never see her again. Unfortunately, she passed away before I could send the letter. Please share my story with everyone so that the world can put an end to domestic violence. Follow us and we may touch your heart again with another story. Thank you.
This is Gary Glitter, one of the worst pedophiles in world history. And this guy was a rock star. This story is extremely disturbing. So all of the bad things that Gary Glitter had done in the past resurfaced in 2019 when The Joker came out. His song was the one that was used during this infamous dancing stairway scene. But let's rewind. Paul Francis Gadd was born in 1944 in England. It was in the year 1971 during the glam rock movement when Paul began to use the stage name Gary Glitter and his career really took off. The release of his album titled Glitter was a massive success. The song Rock and Roll reached high points on all charts across the world, and he seemed to be this, new age progressive rock and roll star. And for years, Gary was heralded as a rock and roll icon. This guy was loved by thousands, millions of people across the planet. But that would all change in the year 1997 when Gary took his computer into a repair shop in England. The technician at the time that was taking a look at Gary's laptop discovered CP images on his hard drive. The police then got involved. They searched his home and found even more CP. This guy was sick. After all was said and done, it was discovered that Gary had downloaded over 4,000 images of CP onto his computer. He had also had a relationship with a 14-year-old girl in the 1970s, and he was given a 4-month prison sentence. After he was released from prison, Gary felt the heat from the public now hating him in England, so he fled to another country. But after the authorities in Cambodia discovered who he was exposed, and he was then deported to Bangkok. He eventually settled, though, in Vietnam. And it was in Vietnam where Gary resumed his typical pedo behaviors. He was banned from a nightclub for groping a teenage waitress. Other people saw him bringing 2 young girls into his home. And on November 12, 2005, Gary fled his home in Vietnam. Authorities eventually searched the place and found a 15-year-old girl that was living with him. He then tried to escape the country, but he was arrested at the airport. And from that point on, multiple Vietnamese girls came forward that were underage and said that Gary Glitter had, assaulted them in the past. After all was said and done, he was sentenced to about 3 years in prison in Vietnam. And if he would have been convicted on all the charges that he faced, he might have been executed by firing squad. Eventually, though, he served his sentence and he was released in Vietnam, and after a lot of countries said they wouldn't let Gary Glitter in, he returned home to the UK. But he wasn't safe there. He was arrested shortly after arriving back in the UK after he faced a number of new allegations against him. Eventually, he was charged with 8 counts of sexual offenses against girls from the ages of 12 to 14 in the years 1977 to 1980. One of these charges alleged that he even crept into a 10-year-old girl's bed and attempted to essay her. So after a lengthy trial, he was finally caught again. He was imprisoned, but he could be released next year in 2023. I know that the movie The Joker received a lot of backlash for using Gary Glitter's song because he was compensated with royalties, even after all of these things had happened to him. And yeah, this just shows that this guy was not and is not a good dude.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another spooky video. As one of the most popular national parks in the US, Yellowstone brings joy to millions of visitors each year. But few realize the sinister secrets that lurk just below the surface. I recently came across some chilling tales from Yellowstone insiders that suggest more is going on than meets the eye. From unexplained creatures, paranormal activity, government cover-ups, this iconic park is a hotbed for the unexplained. In this special 2-part series, we'll count down the 5 creepiest true stories to ever come out of Yellowstone. Make sure to stick around until number 1. You seriously won't believe it. Let's begin. First story comes from a shaken man who had a terrifying middle-of-the-night encounter during a solo road trip. He was awoken by an eerie voice whispering his name from the darkness. Still groggy, he assumed it was his wife and he followed the voice into the woods. But there was no sign of his wife or any other human. Instead, he stumbled upon a tall, hair-covered, humanoid creature with claws and glowing eyes. It stared directly at him and beckoned him closer with an elongated claw. The petrified man ran as fast as he could all the way back to his tent, where he whimpered for hours. By dawn, there was no trace of the creature. Park officials dismissed his story, but we know what happened. What manner of beast could mimic human speech and vanish into thin air? This was no ordinary animal encounter. In the 1990s, a park ranger and his colleagues stumbled upon a ghastly scene deep in the park's back country. In a remote forest clearing lay 7 headless bodies in black robes, arranged in a circle, the ritualistic setup pointing to the occult. Nearby, a massive pentagram was carved into the earth, but the thing that struck fear into the rangers' hearts, the victims' heads, were nowhere to be found. They had been torn from their bodies in a savage fashion. This was no ordinary cult killing. What demonic forces compelled someone or something to commit such a bloodthirsty act? And who or what did the robed figures worship in the dark forest shrine? The answers remain lost in time, buried with the victims' skulls. Our next missing person case defies all logical explanation. In the 1990s, an entire family, mom, dad, teenage son, young daughter, and baby, all vanished from their campsite without a trace. Their tent was left perfectly intact, their car still parked where they left it. It was as if they just simply disappeared. No trace of the family was ever found despite massive search efforts from park officials and law enforcement. They found no signs of a struggle or forced adoption. The distraught family seemed to have just been erased from existence. Now, some suggest sinister supernatural forces were at play, and others believe that the government knows more than they let on. But one thing's for certain, something tragic happened to that poor family. By far the most terrifying account comes from a former park ranger who served between 1989 and 1991. It was a period plagued with bizarre occurrences, missing person, mutilated bodies, frightening creature sightings. The higher-ups dismissed it all until our ranger had a horrifying encounter. Responding to camper reports, he and his partner tracked a creature to a remote cavern. What they saw next still haunts them. A beast emerged that was part bear, part wolf, part humanoid. It towered over them with claws like daggers. The rangers described its blood-red eyes filled with rage, burning itself into their memory. They barely escaped with their lives, fleeing that cursed cave. Alright everyone, buckle up because things are about to get intense. Our number one most disturbing true story will make you think twice about visiting Yellowstone. Final account comes from a construction foreman named Edward. By all accounts, Edward was a normal, blue-collar guy before his life was turned upside down while camping in the Yellowstone in the late 80s. Edward vanished without a trace for over a week. When he mysteriously resurfaced, he was found wandering the trails naked and deranged. What investigators uncovered was the stuff of nightmares. Edward recalled being dragged from his tent by a hulking creature he called the Bear Man. It took him deep underground to a light-filled cavern filled wall to wall with human remains. There he saw several more genetic hybrid monsters that fed him, experimented on him, and held him captive. The creatures tormented Edward relentlessly until they finally released him back onto the surface with a chilling warning: tell no one of this place. Edward spent the rest of his life in a psychiatric ward, broken both physically and mentally. Park officials wrote it off as a schizophrenic delusion, but how could Edward recall underground tunnels that no one knew existed?
What? Look in there, mate. Look in there. What? Look in there.
Just got an alert from our neighborhood thing saying, urgent alert, missing white cats. Please go look outside. It's an emergency. We don't have a flashlight with real batteries, but I do have my LED panel. So let's go look for this cat. Look how cute she is with her headlamp. This is why I told my mom that I need slippers with a sole that goes up over the edges, specifically for looking for cats out in the snow. This just in, the cat's name is Tofu. It's so cute. Tofu. Tofu. Apparently the cat is like way so far away. There's no reason it should be out by our house. At least not yet.
He's never been outside before.
Did you say $1,000 reward?
Yep.
Babe, we gotta go back out. We gotta go back out. I'm sorry. I gotta get my coat. We gotta find tofu.
This is one of the most horrific cases I've heard recently, so please be warned before watching. 29-year-old Taylor Parker has just been sentenced to death for a crime so horrendous that I can't believe a human is capable of this. Regan Simmons Hancock and Taylor had met online. Their online friendship soon blossomed into a real-life connection. It was 2022 and Regan was married with a young daughter. She was also 8 months pregnant at this time. Taylor was also pregnant, or so it would seem to the outside world. She was posting pregnancy pictures on social media and even hosted a gender reveal party. Little did her loved ones know that she was actually staging the entire thing. Regan and Taylor were really good friends around this time and they were bonding over their pregnancies. Regan even shared a Facebook status thanking Taylor for bringing her round a gift and Starbucks. This was the day before she would be murdered by Taylor. On Taylor's supposed due date, she made her way round to Regan's house in Texas. Shortly after, Regan's mum made a horrifying discovery. Her daughter was face down on the floor, deceased with blood everywhere. Her mum rang the emergency services and they raced to the scene. It became apparent that her baby had been, and again a massive trigger warning here, ripped out of her stomach, and Regan had been stabbed over 100 times. Meanwhile, Taylor was pulled over for speeding and driving erratically. She'd actually put the baby in her lap with the umbilical cord coming out of her trousers to make it seem like she'd just given birth. When the pair were taken to hospital, the horrors of what actually happened became apparent. The newborn baby tragically passed away and Taylor was arrested. She was sentenced to death, but her defense lawyer said that her loved ones should have done more to protect her earlier on when she was pretending to be pregnant.
Go to fall asleep while he's playing these videos. And I wake up and I hear this heavy breathing sound and he's literally touching himself over my sleeping body. I laid there frozen and I knew like, okay, Savannah, if you open your eyes, if you move more than you would normally move if you're sleeping, he might try to force you to participate. Like he might try to like, I don't know, like rape you or like, I just know that I don't want to have sex with this person. He finished and went to the bathroom. I looked for my phone and it wasn't there. And I was just thinking like, I've been gone for, I don't even know what time it is. I need to get back. And then I guess I fell back asleep sometime when he was like in the shower. And I wake up and he's making eggs, like as if nothing happened. And I look at the phone, it's like probably 5, 6, 7 p.m. the next day. But I'm like, oh my God, my roommates need to know where I am. It's like the next day. I didn't plan to be out this long. And he's like, oh no, don't worry, love. Why are you worrying about these things? I'm here for you. Then he starts saying stuff like out of nowhere casual, like when we have babies, they won't be vaccinated. And how he's picked an island for us to go live on to repopulate the planet when it's eventually completely taken out by nuclear warfare. And I'm like, I really need my phone. And I realize at this point while I'm searching around the bed, searching around the pillows, he has my phone. I finally give myself permission to allow myself to be heard. And I was like, I need to connect to Wi-Fi to talk to my roommates about when I'll be back. I don't even remember how I convinced him to give me my phone and let me connect to Wi-Fi. I finally do, and I have all these messages from a few of my flatmates who were like, we're getting really worried. And I'm like, it's okay. I was downplaying it because, to be honest, I thought there was nothing that insane going on. So I tell him I'm going to take a phone call outside. And he tells me, what are you doing? You don't need to leave. And he walks over to the door and he looks at me and he goes like this for me to give him my phone. When he did that, his energy and the look in his eyes shifted from this like fake happy guy who's gonna drive you around everywhere to like, I just like handed over my phone. I just knew like it was another moment where like, do you wanna see where this might escalate to? Then he just stopped and like went back to like in the kitchen making eggs again, like everything's normal and we're having brunch.